The series begins with a somber scene, a funeral procession for fallen soldiers. Flashback to 2 weeks earlier, at the Incirtec Air Base in Syria. We see James Reese, a commanding officer in the Navy SEALs, gathering his team to brief them on a mission to capture Dr. Jahan Kahani. The team strategizes and prepares to move out under the cover of darkness. As they approach their target, Reese and his team move cautiously and quietly, but they soon discover a deadly trap laid by the enemy. Gunshots ring out, catching them off guard, and they find themselves vastly outnumbered. Forced to retreat, they fall back and contact headquarters, surprised at the sheer number of enemy troops awaiting them. Amidst the chaos of the failed mission, one member of Reese's team panicked and triggered a massive explosion that killed several of their comrades. In that moment, Reese was reminded of a past memory, a crow hitting his home's window, causing him to lose his sense of reality. But as he regained consciousness, he saw his friend Donnie lying dead beside him. Though he was injured and under heavy fire from the enemy, Reese managed to escape with the only other surviving member of his team, Boozer. Devastated by the loss of his comrades, Reese called his wife Laura to deliver the tragic news that he and Boozer were the only survivors. Later, Reese gave a candid interview to U.S. military officials, recounting the events that led to the mission's failure. At that moment, Reese watched the recording in disbelief. The footage claimed that Donnie, his army man, was responsible for the explosion. But Reese knew it couldn't be true. Donnie was a dedicated soldier, not the type to make such a grave error. He argued that the explosion was caused by one of the PDS troops who were overwhelmed with panic. He felt the recording had been edited to make it seem like his army was at fault. After the interview, Reese went for a medical examination and was declared fit to fly home. He couldn't wait to reunite with his family. But before he went home, Reese decided to grab a drink with Boozer at a nearby bar. There he met Katie Buranek, a persistent reporter who wanted to know why the Navy SEALs hadn't issued a statement about the recent deaths of 12 servicemen. Reese wasn't keen to talk to the press and refused to give her any information. As the conversation ended, Boozer walked out of the bar, leaving Reese alone to contemplate his journey home. The next day, Reese finally arrived in California, where he was met by his best friend, Ben. During their ride to his house, he confided in Ben that his army had been falsely accused and that someone had tampered with the audio recording of the incident. As soon as they arrived at Reese's home, he was greeted with open arms by his wife, Laura, and his daughter, Lucy. Laura immediately shared the news that Reese had suffered a concussion and needed to rest, which prompted him to recall the explosion that caused his injury. The following day, he was relaxing with his family when he received an unexpected call from Navy SEAL headquarters. The caller delivered shocking news and urged him to come to headquarters immediately. As Reese arrived at the location directed by Navy SEAL headquarters, he was shocked to find himself standing in front of Boozer's house. His surprise deepened when he learned that Boozer had been declared dead by killing himself 2 days prior. However, he vehemently denied the investigators' conclusions, as he had been with Boozer just the day before, recalling their return flight home together. Reese then made his way to the Navy SEAL headquarters, where he met with his commanding officer, Admiral Filler. He explained once again that his army had been set up to carry out their last mission. However, Filler was aware that Reese had been diagnosed with a concussion and memory loss, and therefore ordered him to take time off from work. One of Reese's commanders added to the confusion by claiming that Boozer had taken his own life with his own gun. His statement left him even more uncertain about the truth behind Boozer's death. Shortly after, Reese confided in Ben once again, stressing that he believed it was impossible for Boozer to have taken his own life with his own gun. His conviction that he and his army had been set up only grew stronger. Ben, who was concerned about his well-being, suggested that Reese take a break and go sailing with his family. However, Reese was determined to find out if he was truly sick or not. He returned home and attempted to email Katie, whom he had met at the bar with Boozer. He hoped that Katie could confirm whether or not he was alone at the time of their meeting. The story shifted back to the funeral of Reese's army. The ceremony was attended by high-ranking officials, including the United States Secretary of Defense, Ms. Lorraine. He paid his respects by placing a service sign for his army. After the funeral, she requested a private conversation with him. Ms. Lorraine revealed that Musa, the individual who had provided information about Kahani and Reese's failed mission, had been killed and had pocketed money from the rebel forces. She assured him that the military would inform him first if Kahani were to be found. On the way home, Reese sensed that he was being followed. He informed Laura about the situation and urged her to protect their daughter. Then he cautiously approached the car and pointed his weapon, only to find that Katie was the one inside the car. It turned out that Katie had a secret plan to meet with Reese, but she had to follow him discreetly to his house. After some probing, she revealed that Boozer had died on the same night they had met at the bar. Despite her pressing for answers, Reese refused to divulge any information and demanded that her leave. Before leaving, she left her business card, hoping he might have a change of heart. He was left with a throbbing headache and memories of his past, wondering if he was somehow involved in Boozer's death. Feeling uneasy about his situation, Reese stowed away his gun in a private safe and shared his concerns with his wife. He speculated that something might have gone wrong during his past operations and that he needed medical help. Ultimately, he decided to visit a specialist brain clinic to investigate further. There, he underwent a brain scan to identify any issues that might be affecting him. The doctor supervising the procedure left him in a room to begin the scanning process. As the scan progressed, Reese's mind wandered back to the moment when a bomb went off in a tunnel. He had been yanked out of there, but not by the doctor. Instead, a gun-wielding figure in black had seized him. This event was a revelation to Reese. He realized that the very same people had murdered his partner, Boozer. With lightning reflexes, he leapt into action and engaged the assailants, leading to a brutal brawl in the room. Despite experiencing a searing headache during the scuffle, he managed to injure one attacker's hand before killing the other with his own gun, the very same firearm he had stored in his safe. This discovery sent Reese into a panic, and he immediately headed home to check on his wife. Unfortunately, his attempts to contact her went unanswered, and upon arriving at his house, his world crumbled to pieces. He discovered that his beloved wife and daughter had been mercilessly shot and killed. The following day, Reese found himself being interrogated by the police, reliving the traumatic events from the previous night. Despite giving them information about the perpetrator, the officer's sketch revealed little progress in the investigation. He was visibly heartbroken by the loss of his wife and daughter. In the evening, Reese's friends and family attempted to lift his spirits with amusing anecdotes from the past. However, his grief lingered, and he opted to go home alone after having a few drinks. Once there, he came across a photo of his daughter, which brought back memories of their happy times together. Suddenly, a bird crashed into the window, and in a moment of confusion, he found himself alone. It took a while, but eventually, he realized that he had been experiencing hallucinations. The following day, an NCIS agent named Joshua Holder visited Reese's home to discuss the recent murder case involving his family. Josh asked Reese to show him the safe where the murder weapon was kept. He obliged, but Josh was skeptical, stating that the safe was impenetrable. He insisted that the perpetrator had an advanced technique to open the safe, and reminded Josh that Boozer didn't end his life, a fact that he believed with conviction. Reese then went to NCIS headquarters to meet with Admiral Filler. He expressed his doubts about NCIS's ability to handle the case and argued that Kahani was responsible for the recent events. He also warned the Admiral that all members of the Navy SEALs were in danger as the killer was still at large. However, Admiral Filler dismissed his concerns and even cursed at him, leading to a heated argument between them. Disappointed by the Admiral's lack of support, Reese decided to leave. On the other hand, Katie goes to visit Josh after he leaves the office, and he takes her to the clinic where Reese was treated after the explosion. Josh explains to her that there is no evidence of an attack at the clinic, and there is no body despite Reese admitting to shooting someone. Forensic evidence suggests that all of the bullets and weapons used belong to Reese. After investigating, Josh suspects that all of the events at the clinic were carried out by Reese himself. He believes that Reese is suffering from memory abnormalities and asks him to undergo a brain scan. When Katie hears this, she rushes to Reese's house to tell him what she learned at the clinic. Katie suggested that Reese needs to find evidence to support his claims, and asked him to sign a power of attorney so she could obtain his medical records. He agreed after asking her to investigate Boozer's death. To stay connected, he gave her a cell phone with a special account. Meanwhile, Reese tried to find out who Joshua Holder really was. However, he began to experience hallucinations, which led him to believe that Josh was involved in the attack. He even wrote Josh's name behind his daughter's picture, which he kept with him. The following day, Reese wasted no time and conducted a thorough investigation on Josh, the person who attacked him. After gathering evidence, he went to Ben's house to report his findings. According to him, Josh was responsible for the attacks on him and Boozer, as he was hired by Kahani to hunt them down. To gather more intel, Reese disguised himself as a potential tenant and went to Josh's apartment. He meticulously studied all the security systems in place, searching for a weak point to enter Josh's home. After observing the door lock's shape, Josh quickly learned how to pick it. Meanwhile, while playing poker, Katie's colleague Jason visited her and expressed his concerns about Katie avoiding him lately. He also asked her to finish the latest news on Reese so that it could be published immediately. As Josh left his apartment, Ben, who was keeping watch from inside a car, quickly alerted Reese of the target's movement. Soon after, he wasted no time and rushed to Josh's apartment. With a few deft moves, Reese unlocked the door and began scanning the apartment. His eyes fell on Josh's laptop sitting on a table, and without hesitation, he started copying all the data that looked valuable. Satisfied with his haul, Reese replaced the laptop and left the apartment. Back at Ben's house, he began sifting through the copied data. But just as he was getting started, his phone rang. It was Ms. Lorraine, requesting a meeting with him. Soon after, Reese met with Ms. Lorraine and reminded her about the dangerous NCIS ally of Kahani, urging her to take action. To his surprise, she informed him that Kahani was no longer a problem. The news of Kahani's death during a U.S. military operation in Syria broke out on the news, and everyone was overjoyed. Later that evening, Ben rushed to Reese's house with alarming news. Josh had accessed Reese's biometric data and uncovered his fingerprints 2 days before the murders. This solidified Ben's suspicions that Josh was the perpetrator. Then Reese remembered the wound he inflicted on one of the attackers and knew that Josh was the one. To seek justice for his family and Boozer, Ben gave him a special weapon. Elsewhere, Katie arrived at the clinic where Reese was undergoing a brain scan to retrieve the test results. Despite the nurse's initial reluctance to hand over the file, her small bribe did the trick. She then contacted Jordan, promising some exciting news. In the dead of night, Reese sneaked into Josh's apartment, finding him fast asleep. With gun in hand, he examined Josh's hands for scars but found none. He demanded to know who Josh worked for but was plagued by memories of past interrogations that gave him a pounding headache. Undeterred, Reese persisted, but the pain grew unbearable. Just then, Josh made a call to Sol Agnon, who had paid him to manipulate Reese's case. As Josh fought back, Reese was forced to act quickly, shooting Josh before he could do any harm. He made it look like Josh was killing himself, untied him, and left the scene. Back at his house, Reese burned all of Josh's files and added Sol Agnon's name to his hit list. He scoured the internet for information on Sol Agnon before urgently summoning Katie to meet him. Meanwhile, Ms. Lorraine called a meeting with all members of the Ministry of Defense to discuss budget allocation plans. She proposed reducing the length of assignments for special forces like Reese's team. Unbeknownst to her, Reese was already gearing up for his next mission, carefully preparing his weapons. In the meantime, the Ministry of Defense members were pushing back against Ms. Lorraine's budget request. However, she remained firm in her stance, recognizing the soldiers' invaluable contributions to the cause. Shortly after, Reese arrived at a restaurant to meet Katie, who had some information about Sol Agnon and his employer, Captone Industries. He was curious about the company's asset value, which surpassed the limit set by regulations. He was also interested in learning where the company kept the rest of its assets. Then Katie provided Reese with a dossier containing information about Captone Industries and its connections to a shell corporation in Belize. He realized that this was the lead he needed to avenge his family and Boozer, and asked her to help him gain access to Captone Industries' offshore bank accounts. After that, Katie shared some alarming news with Reese. His recent medical exam revealed tumor cells in his brain, which explained the frequent headaches he had been experiencing. Despite his disbelief, she urged him to get a biopsy for a more accurate diagnosis. One day, while at the clinic, Reese spotted a suspicious man who he recognized as a soldier. Fearing for their safety, he hastily left with Katie. However, the soldier pursued them, and in the ensuing chaos, he intentionally crashed his car into the soldier's vehicle. The soldier shot him upon exiting the car, but Reese was able to quickly incapacitate the soldier and retrieve a folder from his car. At that moment, Reese discovered that he was being hunted and that the map he retrieved contained information about him. In an effort to stay safe, he decided to go into hiding, but not before arming Katie and sharing information about Captone Industries. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers, led by Steve Horn, conducted tactical exercises. After training, Steve headed to his office at Captone Industries, where he was the CEO. It was revealed that Sol, who worked for Steve, informed him about Gordo's death, the man Reese had shot in self-defense earlier. Sol expressed concern that Reese was still alive and may know something about them. Little did he know, Reese had already killed Josh. Despite this, Steve reminded him to stay focused on their deal, Plano, which had cost Captone Industries a lot of money. That night, Reese was staying in a hotel and took medicine for his recurring headaches. He had vivid hallucinations of being at home with his pregnant wife and suddenly hearing an explosion and crows crashing into his house. The dream ended abruptly, and he woke up in the morning. Not long after, Ben arrived with food and information for Reese, revealing that the NCIS had issued a search warrant for him because the man he killed on the street was a former marshal working for Thanos Tactical. He advised Reese to stay hidden while he gathered intel on Captone Industries. The next day, Sol met with business partners Elias and Mike at a golf course to finalize the purchase of a company. However, Ben was also there to gather intelligence on Sol. Throughout the meeting, Sol attempted to convince Elias to bid for Nubellum Company, which was led by Mike. It was unclear what Steve's motive was for the sale. As Ben continued to surveil Sol from afar, he updated Reese on the situation. Meanwhile, Katie sought refuge in a beach house and called Jordan to confess misjudging Reese. She asked for permission to leave town and quickly hung up. On the other hand, Ms. Lorraine was in her office when Rich, a member of the Ministry of Defense, questioned her decision, concerned it would negatively impact their ranking. He also speculated that their contractor may not agree with her proposal, but she remained firm in her decision. Soon after, he immediately entered his office and made a call on his encrypted cell phone after Ms. Lorraine remained firm in her decision. That night, Reese visited a nightclub and met a woman named Raven who offered him methadone to relieve his headaches. As he waited for her to bring the drug, Reese reminisced about his army days. Shortly after, he returned to his room with the methadone and began preparing his weapons with Ben. Meanwhile, Sol held a party at a luxurious house to convince Elias to make an offer for his company. Despite his persistence, Elias remained indecisive until Sol gave him an ultimatum. Then Elias finally agreed to inform the acquisition team and make an offer the next morning. Sol breathed a sigh of relief after finally convincing Elias to make a decision. He quickly disbanded the party and instructed everyone to go home. Exhausted, he retreated to his room, looking forward to some much-needed rest. However, his plans were abruptly interrupted when Reese sneaked into his room undetected. When Sol stepped into the bathroom for a quick wash, he soon heard music playing outside his room. Puzzled, he went to investigate, only to find that no one was there. Suddenly, Reese appeared out of nowhere, covering his head with a plastic bag and tying his hands from behind in one swift motion. Sol was taken aback by the sudden attack, and he could feel his heart racing with fear as he struggled to break free from Reese's grip. Sol's eyes flickered open, and his stomach churned with nausea. He retched violently, gasping for air as he struggled to gather his thoughts. Desperately, he cried out for help, but no one answered his pleas. His men were nowhere to be found, leaving him alone and vulnerable. Reese, who had orchestrated Sol's kidnapping, appeared out of the shadows, demanding answers. He demanded to know why Captone Industries wanted Sol dead. Sol protested his innocence, insisting that he had done nothing wrong. But Reese was not convinced and threatened him until he revealed a name, Steve Horn. Sol confessed that Steve was the mastermind behind the plan, and he knew nothing about Project RD-4895, except that it was worth a fortune. Then Reese pressed for more information, demanding to know who had been sent to kill his family. Sol mentioned a lawyer named Marcus Boykin, who was involved in the black market, including in Mexico. After extracting the information he needed from Sol, Reese decided to put an end to his suffering. He injected methadone into Sol's veins, ensuring that he would die peacefully. Meanwhile, Katie was busy scouring her office for any information about Captone Industries. Reese had recently sent her a message warning her about Project RD-4895 and urging her to be cautious. Reese also briefed Ben on his plans, showing him a drawing paper with two new names, Steve Horn, who would explain Project RD-4895 to him, and Marcus, who would lead him to the killers of his wife and daughter. Later, Reese took his daughter on an adventure in the forest. As they climbed to the top of a hill, he realized that it was all just an illusion. He was alone, continuing his mission to seek justice for his family by tracking down their killers. Armed with the information he had obtained from Sol, Reese began his pursuit of Marcus Boykin. He found the perfect vantage point atop a hill and patiently waited for his target to come into view. When Marcus finally approached, Reese took aim and fired a single, fatal shot, causing his car to overturn. Soon after, Reese approached the wreckage and found Marcus dying. He quickly seized the opportunity to grab Marcus's cell phone and extract all the information he could. Satisfied that he had what he needed, Reese set his sights on his next destination, Mexico. At that time, Reese asked the help of his Navy friend Liz Riley, and together, they embarked on a perilous journey to uncover the truth behind his family's murder. Before departing, he contacted Ben and informed him of his plans, crossing out Marcus's name on his list of targets. At FBI headquarters, Agent Tony Leon led a team in analyzing footage of a recent shooting in the streets. As they examined the tape, Tony quickly realized that the shooter, Reese, was highly skilled and had extensive combat experience, having been deployed 8 times and received numerous commendations. Despite this, he remained determined to crack the case and ordered his team to investigate who was in the car with Reese during the incident. Meanwhile, Katie continued her investigation into Project RD-4895 and the companies associated with it. However, her focus was abruptly interrupted when her brother Brian, along with his wife and daughter, unexpectedly arrived and entered the house she was in. Startled by their sudden arrival, Katie tried to make sense of the situation. She soon learned that the house she was staying in actually belonged to Brian, and the uninvited visitors were her own family. On the other hand, a tense meeting was underway at Captone Industries where Steve revealed that there were budget cuts and reallocations at the Pentagon which made the situation unfavorable. Elias, who had planned to purchase Nubellum, delayed his arrival due to the risks involved with Sol Agnon's death. Steve advised the Nubellum company to remain patient and continue with their sales process. However, Mike, the head of Nubellum, expressed doubts about his partnership with Steve because of Sol's murder, who was Captone's deputy director. The next day, Reese and Riley arrived in Mexico, where they were greeted by Reese's longtime friends, Marco and Paula. The group sat down for a delightful lunch, reminiscing about old times. As they caught up, Reese expressed his deep affection for this place, which held a special place in his heart. As the night approached, Reese couldn't help but think back to his past memories, when his wife and daughter were once there, having fun. Later that night, Reese contacted Katie to ask about the progress of Project RD-4895. In response, she conveyed her assurance that his team had correctly identified the tumor. In the middle of the night, Reese was jolted awake by a searing headache, causing him to hallucinate about Lucy once again. Despite being in intense pain, he made his way towards the exit where he ran into Ben, Marco, and Riley. To his relief, Marco revealed that his men had located the person responsible for the murders of Lauren and Lucy. Meanwhile, at Katie's residence, Tony's agent and team arrived to ask about James Reese. Katie staunchly defended Reese, insisting that he was innocent of killing his family. She also urged Tony to speak to Sol Agnon and question how Captone Industries could have given a platoon of Navy SEALs a brain tumor. Unbeknownst to her at the time, Sol had already passed away, which left her shocked. In the end, Tony left his business card with Katie in case she learned of Reese's whereabouts. As Rich arrived at his office, Steve approached him urgently, revealing that their entire business was under threat due to a proposed budget by Ms. Lorraine, the Minister of Defense, and Senator Joe Pryor, a key decision-maker. Steve implored Rich to bring Senator Joe Pryor to him, hoping that they could find a solution to the impending crisis. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Reese and his team strategized to take down the individuals responsible for his family's murders. Through Marco's sources, Reese learned that the culprit was a hitman named Navas, who worked for local drug cartels and had recently sustained a significant injury to one arm. This wound matched the injury Reese had inflicted on the perpetrator during their earlier encounter at the clinic. Initially, Reese intended to launch a frontal assault with only Ben as his ally. However, Marco also wished to join the mission, seeing it as an opportunity to eliminate the wickedness in Mexico. While they were still discussing plans, Reese was suddenly overcome by a painful headache that eventually caused him to lose consciousness. After some time, Reese's medical examination revealed that the tumor was growing at an alarming rate. The doctor recommended that Reese undergo a biopsy performed by a skilled surgeon in Mexico City with a recovery period of 6 to 9 months. Despite the severity of his condition, Reese remained reluctant to follow the doctor's advice and only requested medication to alleviate the persistent headaches that plagued him. This was because he was preparing to carry out the mission to avenge his family. The severity of Reese's illness had raised concerns from his allies, Ben, Riley, and Marco, who questioned his ability to carry out the mission. However, despite the gravity of his condition, Reese was resolute in his decision to pursue his goal, as Navas had taken everything that he cherished in life. As Reese was preparing his weapons in his room, Paula visited him and implored him not to return once the mission was over, should he survive. She acknowledged that he might seek revenge for his family's death, but she urged him not to involve his friends in the dangerous mission. Long story short, the team's mission to attack Navas began amidst a rainy weather. They quickly immobilized one of his men and slowly advanced towards his headquarters. Then Ben created a diversion by tampering with the radio, which drew Navas' other men out of their positions. Once out in the open, they were swiftly taken down by Reese's team as they entered the shooting zone. On the other hand, Reese and his team kept pushing forward, continuing to neutralize enemy troops. The gunfire intensified as they engaged in a fierce battle with Navas' men. Despite the odds, Reese's team proved to be highly skilled and experienced in warfare, gaining the upper hand in the conflict. They even managed to rescue several child hostages who were being held captive there. Not long after, as they closed in on Navas, Ben took a bullet, but urged Reese to keep going. Then he caught up to Navas and shot him, but Navas still wasn't down. Fueled by the desire for vengeance for the murder of his wife and daughter, Reese beat Navas until he was unconscious, then dragged him outside. There, he hanged Navas, who suffered a painful death. It was a brutal end to a long and difficult pursuit, but he had finally avenged his loved ones. On the other hand, Katie and Brian were enjoying their time at the beach when she took the opportunity to apologize for what had happened at his house. Fortunately, he was understanding and didn't mind. Suddenly, Katie's friends called her with shocking news about Nubellum Pharmaceuticals, which had been acquired by Steve Horn and transferred to the military sector with a huge contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. The company had been producing medicine for 6 branches and was now going to be sold for an eye-watering $70 billion. Katie was instantly worried and hurriedly left Brian's house. Unbeknownst to her, Tony and his team had been spying on her from outside. Back to Reese, as he was preparing to depart Mexico and return to the United States, he was approached by Ben, who handed him a file with detailed information about Steve Horn. He was grateful for the help and felt more prepared to face Horn. However, before leaving, Reese took the time to bid farewell to Marco and his family, expressing his gratitude for their assistance in completing the mission. As a token of appreciation, he gifted Marco a weapon that had been passed down from his father. It was a heartfelt gesture that symbolized the bond they had formed during their time together. The scene transitions to Najaf, Iraq in 2007, where Riley, a non-commissioned officer, urgently requests Reese's assistance in the midst of enemy pressure. Although he couldn't provide air support, he led his troops into the war zone to rescue Riley. After arriving at the site, Reese quickly located Riley, who was exhausted and had sustained a broken spine in battle. Reese comforted Riley and promised to bring him home. In a surprising turn of events, Lucy suddenly appeared and asked him if everything would be all right. Suddenly, he woke up from his slumber and realized that it was all just a vivid dream, even though it felt exceptionally real. At that moment, Reese realized he was still aboard the plane with Riley. Struggling with a pounding headache, he took some pain medication and focused on his mission, reviewing his list of targets. Meanwhile, at Captone Industries, Mike met with Steve, the company's majority shareholder. He offered to sell the RD-4895 research and its patents to Steve while retaining ownership of his own company, Nubellum. However, Steve had other plans and demanded that Captone purchase Nubellum in its entirety. Stunned by his ultimatum, Mike was left speechless. At Riley's headquarters, Reese proposed a direct attack on Captone Industries' tower. However, Riley objected, citing the high civilian presence in the financial district. Acknowledging his valid concerns, Reese decided to conduct a reconnaissance mission on the tower to gather more information. Upon arriving at Captone Industries' tower, Reese and Riley spotted Tony and his team member, Mackenzie, entering the building. Shortly after, Tony approached Steve and asked about Gordon, a supervisor who Reese had killed. Then he confirmed that Gordon had not been on duty at the time of his death. Fearing for Steve's safety, Tony mobilized a team to guard the area around Captone Industries' tower. Meanwhile, Katie arrived at Nubellum's office to interview Tony. During the interview, she expressed her curiosity about Nubellum's activities since it had been acquired by Captone Industries. She questioned Mike about his decision to focus on developing military nitropes, rather than the previous field of research. However, he evaded the question, excusing himself to use the restroom. Soon after, Katie followed Mike and confronted him about his concerns regarding Steve's actions towards his company. She also asked about Project RD-4895 and revealed that it had caused tumors in its users. In response, he clarified that the project had not yet reached human trials. However, Katie vehemently opposed Mike's claim and revealed a harrowing truth: the project had been tried on a platoon of Navy SEALs who had vanished during their mission. Hearing that, he was stunned and at a loss for words, unsure of what she meant. As Katie prepared to leave, she jotted down her contact information for Mike, urging him to reach out when he was ready to discuss further. Unbeknownst to them, Tony's men were keeping a close eye on Katie and trailed her as she left. Meanwhile, Reese persisted in scouting the area around the imposing Captone Industries tower. Moments later, he rushed back to Riley's hangar and immediately launched into a discussion on their next move. As they plotted their course, Riley noticed Reese's hands trembling, a telltale sign that something was amiss. Despite his condition, Reese insisted that they press on with their mission. Worried for Katie's safety, Reese advised her to steer clear of the problems he had created. He had recently discovered that the FBI was tailing her, which only added to her unease. The following day, Steve monitored the negotiations for Nubellum's acquisition by Elias and other company officials. But when Steve asked for bidding figures, Elias abruptly ordered everyone out of the room, including Mike, the head of Nubellum, the company Elias was seeking to purchase. At that moment, Steve's plans left Mike bewildered and uncertain about his next move. Concerned about the information he had uncovered about the RD-4895 project, Mike reached out to Katie, who immediately invited him to meet. There, she warned him to leave his phone behind to avoid detection. After their meeting, Mike headed back to Steve's room to apologize for causing chaos during the price negotiations. Then he requested permission to leave and return home. However, moments later, one of Steve's aides barged in and reported that Mike had accessed an internal server and copied some data. The aide also speculated that he might spill the beans to the media. Elsewhere, Katie prepared for her meeting with Mike, arming herself with the gun that Reese had given her just in case. Meanwhile, Steve emerged from his office tower, flanked by a heavily armed guard. However, Reese noticed an anomaly that night when one of Steve's escort vehicles took a separate route. Not long after, Tony tailed the car carrying Steve, while Reese trailed the other vehicle. At the train station, Katie met with Mike, who revealed that the RD-4895 project was created to eliminate post-battle trauma. Shockingly, Steve had terminated the project after performing animal experiments. But 2 months ago, Mike discovered a deviation in the market capitalization table, indicating that some shareholders had been added to the company. As Mike explained the connection between the RD-4895 project and Reese's troops who died in Syria, Katie struggled to comprehend. However, Mike assured her that it was all intertwined. Meanwhile, Reese kept following the car, which surprisingly stopped at the train station where Katie and Mike were meeting. Suddenly, a man exited the vehicle and entered the station. Soon after, Mike gave Katie a flash drive and urged her to release the news immediately if the RD-4895 project was indeed responsible for the Navy SEALs' deaths. He hoped to cancel Elias's purchase agreement for Nubellum. Suddenly, Katie noticed they were being followed and hurried Mike to flee. It turned out that one of Steve's men caught up with them and fatally shot Mike. Soon after, Katie escaped, running up the stairs, but the assailant pursued her. At the top, she shot and killed the attacker in self-defense. As Katie left the station, another Steve's man ambushed her, intent on taking her out. Thankfully, Reese managed to take him out before leading Katie away to a safe location. Once there, Reese offered her a drink to help calm her nerves before asking why Steve was pursuing him. Then Katie revealed that Steve had been testing a drug called RD4895 on Reese and his army. The drug was designed to prevent brain trauma and had shown success in rats and dogs, but unfortunately, it caused them to develop malignant brain tumors. She also explained that if the drug had been successful, it would have made Nubellum the most valuable company in the world. However, since the project failed, Steve was forced to sell the company to avoid a loss of around $15 to $20 billion. After that, Katie continued to explain to Reese that in the past month, Steve had taken $100 million of his shares in Nubellum and distributed them among various shell companies. As Katie finished her explanation, Reese realized that the shares were likely compensation for his men who had been killed in Syria. He asked her for a list of the shell company owners, but she hesitated to provide it. In the end, he took the flash drive that Mike had just given to Katie, despite her protests, as it was a major scoop for her as a journalist. Then he ordered her to stay away from San Francisco, and they parted ways. After that, Reese contacted Ben, who was fast asleep at the time. He provided Ben with the capitalization table data containing all the shell companies in Steve's network, which had benefited from Project RD4895. Ben could use this data to uncover the owners of these companies. The next day, Rich arrived at his office, searching for something. Ms. Lorraine appeared with Rich's encrypted cell phone, which she had retrieved. As they discussed the phone, an agent from DCIS named Hazard arrived and revealed suspicious payments from Steve to an account under Rich's mother's name over the past 2 years. This was concerning as his parents had passed away long ago. At that moment, Ms. Lorraine began to suspect that he was involved in Steve's criminal activities and wanted to use him to get revenge. Shortly after the first call, Ben called Reese again with some troubling news. His targets, Sol and Marcus, had been matched by a few unexpected names: Admiral Filler, Captain Howard, and Commander Cox. These 3 men were not only owners of the company but also Reese's superiors in the Navy SEALs. To Reese's surprise, this discovery only fueled his anger. He immediately instructed his accomplice, Riley, to purchase chemicals for making a bomb. But Riley pushed back, pointing out that innocent civilians could be harmed in an explosion. Then he countered that the EFB bomb was incredibly accurate and there would be no collateral damage. Long story short, Riley procured all the necessary materials and they swiftly got to work crafting the bomb. Once they finished, they cleared out the hangar and prepared to carry out their plan. As they approached the Captone Industries tower, Reese spotted Steve's escort car parked in its usual spot in front of his office. Then he instructed Riley to keep a lookout while he proceeded with the mission. Meanwhile, Tony and Mackenzie made their own preparations and positioned themselves near Steve's office in anticipation of what was to come. Interestingly, the press had gathered in large numbers, drawn by the news of an impending deal between Steve and Elias, who was in talks to purchase Nubellum's company. Among the journalists was Katie, who was covering the event. Shortly after, Steve exited his office building flanked by a team of heavily armed guards. He then addressed the press, speaking about the recent loss of a colleague at his company. Meanwhile, Tony noticed a suspicious vehicle causing a traffic jam from a distance. Without hesitation, Tony and Mackenzie headed towards the car. Unbeknownst to them, this was all part of Reese's plan, which involved having Riley create a diversion. Soon after, Reese began to move his car, loaded with explosives, into position, aligning it with Steve's escort vehicle. Then he triggered the bomb just as Steve was about to enter his car. But there was a hitch. Katie suddenly blocked Steve from getting into the car. At that moment, Katie was preparing to leave the area when she spotted Reese blocking her path. There, Steve turned his attention to where Katie was looking and saw Reese too. Sensing danger, he rushed to his car, but Reese swiftly activated the bomb, which slipped into his vehicle and blew up. The force of the blast threw Katie back, and Steve's car was obliterated. Despite suffering severe burns, he miraculously survived the explosion, much to everyone's surprise. Soon after he learned of Steve's location, Reese drew his weapon and went after him. In just a matter of seconds, he overpowered Steve's bodyguards and ruthlessly gunned down Steve on the spot. With no time to lose, Reese fled the scene. But his escape was short-lived as he was pursued by the FBI, led by Tony and Mackenzie. At that time, his vehicle hit a police set mine, causing it to crash into a tree. Despite the setback, Reese remained undeterred and quickly gathered his belongings to leave the area. Meanwhile, Tony and his team had surrounded Reese's car. Upon seeing his gun, they opened fire on him. After a brief standoff, they cautiously approached the vehicle, but Reese was nowhere to be found. They only discovered bloodstains in his medical bag, leaving them to wonder if he had managed to escape. As Reese made his way up the hill, he noticed that his hand was bleeding from a gunshot wound. Seeking refuge, he entered a nearby house in search of medical supplies. After finding a bandage, he tended to his injury and searched his bag for pain relief medication. Unfortunately, he came up empty-handed and had to press on to find the few supplies he needed and a map to guide him. Meanwhile, Riley grew increasingly worried about Reese's safety and was on the phone with Ben discussing their next steps. To make matters worse, a rainstorm was on the horizon. but Ben assured Riley that the storm could work to Reese's advantage, making it harder for pursuers to track him down. On the other hand, Tony coordinated the search efforts with the help of the police and sniffer dogs. At that moment, Reese took shelter in a small cave on the hill and took a moment to reflect on his mission. As he looked at pictures of his daughter, he realized that he still had 3 targets left, all of whom were his former superiors in the Navy SEALs. Memories of his training days with Commander Cox and Ben flooded his mind, and he recalled the commander's advice to never give up in any situation. The following day, Navy SEAL troops arrived to assist in the search for Reese. There, Tony briefed them on the situation and their mission, but one of the Navy SEALs, named Smitty, cautioned that Reese was a legend and a true patriot, making him a difficult target to apprehend. Then Tony decided to lead the search for Reese alongside the Navy SEAL troops, determined to bring him to justice. Meanwhile, Reese continued his escape, despite his weakened condition. He spotted a helicopter flying overhead and searched for a way to distract it. As the search team descended one by one to begin their search, they followed the signal from Reese's phone until they reached a spot in the middle of the forest. Unbeknownst to them, Reese was hiding just below their feet. One of the troops discovered a cell phone deliberately placed under a tree trunk, and he took the opportunity to detonate a smoke bomb, disorienting the team and making a quick getaway. As Reese continued his escape, he outsmarted FBI officers by throwing batteries to create false heat signatures. However, his headache returned, causing him to hallucinate, but Reese pressed on. Suddenly, Tony yelled down the hill, urging Reese to surrender, but he refused and climbed to the top of a hill. From there, Reese, a skilled sniper, had a clear shot at the team chasing him, but he hesitated because he knew they were not his enemy. Moments later, Reese's search team arrived at the hilltop and found only a bullet, leading the Navy SEALs Army to praise his marksmanship. At that moment, he was actually descending the cliff, but his illness resurfaced, causing his hand to shake. Ultimately, he lost his balance and fell. He miraculously survived the fall, but his condition worsened, and he was exhausted from his escape with a worsening wound on his hand. As evening fell and heavy rain poured down, Reese found shelter under the hill, listening to the ongoing search. He was frustrated that he didn't have any medication, so he resorted to cauterizing a wound on his arm with a heated knife to stop the bleeding on his hand. During the night, Tony attempted to convince Reese to give up, warning him that someone might get hurt if he continued. But he remained resolute, determined to exact revenge on those responsible for his family's death. As the search for Reese continued the next day, Tony and his team managed to locate the cave where he was resting, using a drone to aid their search. Meanwhile, Reese was struggling with his weakened condition, experiencing hallucinations and a lack of medication. He also reminisced about his past and the loss of his family. Suddenly, he spotted the drone and shot it down, inadvertently revealing his location to the search team. In an effort to defend himself, Reese began creating homemade bombs and planting them in the ground on the hill where he was hiding. Despite his deteriorating state, he was determined to complete his mission. However, when Mackenzie and the other soldiers finally caught up to him, Reese threatened to detonate the bombs if they didn't back off. He demanded that Mackenzie order his team to hold their positions, gripping the trigger tightly in his hand. However, Mackenzie refused Reese's order as their position was surrounded. Reese, realizing the gravity of the situation, detonated the bombs, causing a violent explosion and sending them tumbling down the hill. Despite the avalanche, he managed to survive, but Mackenzie was knocked unconscious and buried under the snow. Desperately trying to revive Mackenzie, Reese spotted a hand emerging from the ground. It was Mackenzie, who had regained consciousness. Meanwhile, Tony and his team heard Mackenzie's name being called from a distance and rushed to his aid. While they helped Mackenzie, Reese disappeared without a trace. On the other hand, Riley was listening to news about the search for Reese when devastating news came in. Reese was presumed dead after an explosion and an avalanche. But to his surprise, Reese appeared at his doorstep, in relatively good condition. Soon after, Riley quickly tended to Reese's wounds and administered medicine on the plane. Then he told Riley that he saw his wife and daughter in the woods, reliving the memory over and over. Riley urged him to come to terms with reality and let go of his family's memory to move forward. The scene shifted to when Reese suddenly jumped out of the plane to continue his mission. He arrived at a beach where Ben was waiting for him. At night, Reese made his way back to his house, hoping to reconnect with his past and the memories of his wife. Every detail of their last night together played out vividly in his mind, and he couldn't help but smile. But as he entered the house, he came to the realization that he was completely alone. 15 hours earlier, soldiers were busy with exercises on the beach at the Navy SEALs base. Meanwhile, Admiral Filler, Captain Howard, and Commander Cox gathered to discuss Reese's troublesome situation. At that time, Howard was quick to point out that the situation could have serious repercussions for him and his family, and he urged for immediate action to be taken. However, Howard and Commander Cox clashed over their opinions, leading to a heated debate. Shortly after, Admiral Filler stepped in to pacify Howard and reassure him that they had a large contingent of soldiers ready to face Reese's arrival. Meanwhile, Reese observed the trio through binoculars while stationed in the middle of the ocean. Ben informed him that the three of them had been meeting every day since he had killed Stephen. Elsewhere, on her plane, Ms. Lorraine studied CCTV footage where Katie revealed that Steve was responsible for killing Mike and causing Reese's team to suffer from a brain tumor. Hearing that, she was taken aback by the revelation. Later, at her destination, she addressed reporters and announced that James Reese had been declared a domestic terrorist. At the FBI headquarters, Tony briefed his team on their next move to capture Reese. He stressed that their priority was to identify Reese's next target in order to have a better chance of apprehending him. Shortly after, Katie arrived at his office and requested access to Steve's computer data to locate the recipients of funds associated with the RD-4895 project. Meanwhile, Captain Howard arrived home and received a call from Navy SEAL headquarters, which he declined. Then he informed his family that they would be moving to the Key West area of Miami for a vacation until the situation calmed down. Hearing that, his wife and son were taken aback by the sudden news. Unbeknownst to Howard, Ben had been eavesdropping on his conversation with his family about moving. Then Ben quickly informed Reese of the news, warning him of the urgent need to act. With the situation escalating, Reese asked Ben about his next move, since the FBI was closing in and could potentially uncover his involvement. Ben disclosed his plan to retire in a place called Mancora in Peru. Shortly after, Reese got to work, preparing all the necessary equipment for their upcoming mission. Back at FBI headquarters, Tony reported the results of Steve's computer inspection to his superiors with a sense of urgency. The correspondence between Admiral Filaire and others mentioned a drug called RD-4895 and included medical records indicating that Reese and his troops had brain tumors. Shockingly, Admiral Filaire had already known about the tumors and had even received payment for his role in the experiment. Then Tony pointed out that several companies, including Global System Plus, SXA Consulting, and Cintibantics Inc., had received payments, and it was discovered that these companies were owned by Admiral Filaire, Howard, and Commander Cox. It turned out that Marcus Boykin and Sol Agnon also owned companies on the list. The only unknown company was Obron Analytic, and it was unclear who the owner was. Reese's target list was also confirmed to be accurate. Then Tony quickly divided his team into groups to carry out their next steps in this complex investigation. Back at Howard's house, his suspicious wife confronts him about his strange behavior. When she asks what he's hiding, Howard evades her questions and only mentions that Admiral Filaire is involved in some kind of problem, and he wants to keep his distance for the time being. Soon after, an FBI agent arrives at Howard's house to meet with him. To their surprise, the agent is none other than Ben, disguised as an FBI agent. Meanwhile, Tony and another FBI officer have arrived at the Navy SEALs base to gather more information. There, Admiral Filaire meets with Tony and hands over a file, as he is already aware of the purpose of Tony's visit. Moments later, Tony receives an urgent call from Mackenzie, who reports that Captain Howard is nowhere to be found. Despite booking tickets for Miami with his family, they never boarded the plane. Besides that, Mackenzie reveals that Commander Cox has also been declared missing. Earlier, Commander Cox was spotted at a bar trying to relieve some tension. As he exits the bar and approaches his car, Reese suddenly appears and attacks him without warning. Suddenly, a scuffle ensues in the parking area, and Reese manages to paralyze Cox before knocking him unconscious. In the present, Commander Cox wakes up to find himself on a beach with his hands tied to a large log. Shortly after, Reese is standing nearby, and it becomes clear that he is giving Cox the same brutal training that he had received in the past. This time, however, Cox must lift the heavy log alone. He confesses to Reese that Admiral Filaire gave permission for the experiment, a fact that Captain Howard confirms. There, Reese lets Cox die while carrying the heavy burden, and Captain Howard and his family are tied up and guarded by Ben on the same beach. However, Howard tries to justify his actions, explaining that he was only following orders, but Reese demands that he do something. Initially refusing, he is eventually forced to comply with Reese's demands after Reese threatens to harm his wife and son. After that, Reese urged Ben to hold on tight to Captain Howard's wife and son while Howard executed his mission. There, Reese worked tirelessly to keep the boat moving forward. Meanwhile, at the FBI office, Tony received a call from his boss, just as Hazard from DCIS showed up at his door. Tony's leader informed him that he was being removed from his current assignment, and all team members would return to their original departments. However, Tony argued against this, citing the FBI's ongoing investigation into irregularities at the Pentagon. He voiced his suspicions about Admiral Filaire's illegal experimentation on soldiers. However, Hazard rebutted, stating that Filaire had the necessary clearance to authorize the experiments, making them technically legal. Despite this, he felt that Filaire was concealing something. Feeling disheartened, Tony sought comfort in Katie, who had been waiting for him in his room. He confided in her that the Pentagon had authorized the RD-4895 experiment, and then handed her a folder of information about the company owner she had been investigating. Tony urged Katie to finish her story and release it as soon as possible. Soon after, he left to relieve one of his team members who was on guard duty at Reese's house and stationed himself there until a replacement team arrived. Meanwhile, Katie wasted no time and quickly finished her article. She revealed in her report that Ms. Lorraine was the mastermind behind Project RD4895 and that the unnamed owner of the company was suspected to be her. The company had received a whopping $20 million in cash. After completing her article, Katie immediately contacted Jordan to inform him that the news was ready to be published. Then he assured her that the story would be released within the hour. With a sense of relief, she clicked the send button on her laptop. Meanwhile, Reese was at home with Laura, who had just revealed that she was pregnant. However, his hallucinations took hold, and he began to imagine himself walking down an alleyway, reliving traumatic memories from his past missions. His army was shot before his eyes, and he was confronted with several other disturbing images from his past. He was jolted out of his trance by the sound of his watch alarm and noticed a message from Katie on his phone. He read the message and discovered that Ms. Lorraine had approved the RD4895 project. Meanwhile, Howard went to the Navy headquarters alone to confront Admiral Filler. He looked pale and constantly checked his watch. Then he handed Admiral Filler a cell phone and said that Reese wanted to speak to him. After Admiral Filler took the phone, Reese revealed that he had set a trap for him. Then Howard opened his jacket to reveal that he had been carrying explosives, and Reese warned Admiral Filler not to move. Despite the Admiral's pleas for mercy, Reese remained resolute and pressed the button. Suddenly, a massive explosion ripped through his room, obliterating everything in its path. Tony, who was nearby, heard the blast and immediately asked if Reese was responsible for the explosion at the Navy headquarters. Soon after, Tony's team informed him that the bomb could have been detonated remotely, prompting Tony to head to Reese's house to investigate. Upon finding Reese, they engaged in a physical altercation, but Tony managed to gain the upper hand. He revealed that he had evidence of Steve's and Admiral Filler's crimes and urged Reese to work with him to solve the problem. However, Reese refused and knocked him down, warning him to stay away. Meanwhile, Katie grew impatient waiting for the news to be released and contacted Jordan for an update. To her surprise, Jordan informed her that he had not received any news from her. Then she checked her sent email and realized that the news had not been sent. At that moment, Katie was alarmed when she discovered that her email had been intercepted by Ms. Lorraine. As she prepared to leave, Ms. Lorraine appeared and admitted to intercepting Katie's email. Ms. Lorraine claimed that Katie's report was inaccurate and invited her to interview her for the truth. Meanwhile, Reese and Ben were being hunted as terrorists after successfully eliminating 3 high-ranking Navy SEALs. While at a gas station, they watched their faces on TV and Ben suggested they change their appearances. Ben also revealed that Ms. Lorraine had relocated to an island and hired Talos tactical guards to keep her safe from Reese. But despite the potential danger, Reese was determined to confront her. On the other hand, Ms. Lorraine and Katie had just arrived on the secluded island where they were hiding. As they stepped onto the shore, Katie's eyes widened in shock as she spotted the heavily armed soldiers patrolling the area. Despite the danger, Ms. Lorraine had brought Katie along to conduct an in-person interview for her latest article, determined to uncover the truth. As they made their way towards the meeting point, they had to tiptoe around the security measures. Their hearts were racing with fear, but their determination kept them going. Finally, they arrived at the designated location, and Ms. Lorraine began to share her story with Katie. As soon as they arrived at the main house, Ms. Lorraine and Katie wasted no time in conducting an exclusive interview. During the conversation, Ms. Lorraine vehemently denied any involvement with the fictitious company, Oberon Analytics, and categorically denied receiving any payments from Steve Horn. However, Ms. Lorraine did confess to approving the RD4895 project experiment, but only because she believed it could help the U.S. Army veterans. She was unaware that the experiment had caused tumors in the troops who were subjected to it. Moreover, Ms. Lorraine had no idea that the last mission Reese's army carried out was a trap orchestrated by Steve. Shocked and disgusted, she immediately ordered the DCIS unit to investigate the mission and reveal the identity and purpose of those responsible. She emphasized that this was the truth, and one that not everyone was aware of, including Katie. Meanwhile, Tony met with Mackenzie to discuss the latest updates on the Ms. Lorraine and Reese case. Despite being suspended from his job, he remained determined to pursue the investigation and bring all the guilty parties to justice. He confided in Mackenzie that he planned to reach out to someone at the FBI to regain his involvement in the case. Following the interview, Ms. Lorraine provided Katie with a personal statement attesting to the fact that she had never received any payments from Steve. This revelation prompted Katie to immediately reach out to Reese and inform him of her whereabouts with Ms. Lorraine. She asked Reese for some time as there might be a mistake regarding Ms. Lorraine's involvement in the death of Reese's army and family. Unfortunately, Katie's message failed to convince Reese to alter his plans, and he continued his journey to the island where Ms. Lorraine was located. As he and Ben made their way, they were suddenly ambushed by police officers conducting a raid. Undaunted, they steeled themselves for a confrontation with the law. When they reached the checkpoint, a police officer demanded to see Ben's identification card, to which he produced his driving license. Meanwhile, the other officers began to search the car meticulously. Then Reese took cover underneath the bed box, while Ben readied his gun, anticipating a possible altercation. Thankfully, the police officer who checked Ben's ID confirmed that his documentation was in order, and the search was called off. After all of that, Reese and Ben breathed a sigh of relief and managed to escape the scrutiny of the authorities. After some time, Reese and Ben arrived at a secluded beach, where they were met by their friend, Wright. He had arranged for a ship to transport them across the water, as well as a sniper to aid them in their mission. Meanwhile, Tony had managed to contact his FBI colleagues and was now en route to the island where Ms. Lorraine was located, accompanied by Mackenzie and several other agents. On the other hand, as night fell, the security system at Ms. Lorraine's residence came to life, alerting the guards outside. At that time, Katie worked on updating the news story based on the latest information she had obtained from Ms. Lorraine. Shortly after, Ben informed Reese that 15 of Talos's army men were standing watch outside the house. He suggested that they abandon their mission and retire to Peru. Despite the odds stacked against him, Reese was determined to complete the mission and find peace, feeling as if he was fighting alongside the army that had already passed on. He took the plunge and embarked on his final mission. Meanwhile, Katie sat down with Ms. Lorraine for an interview, questioning why she allowed Reese and his team of Navy SEALs to continue with the mission despite the potential risk of death. Though Ms. Lorraine had the power to abort the mission and prevent the tragic loss of life, she chose to let the mission proceed under her command with Admiral Filler. This decision resulted in the devastating outcome of Reese's entire team perishing. At the same time, Reese had reached the island, arming himself for battle, while Ben readied his sniper from the lighthouse tower. With one shot, Ben blew up a ship, and the explosion caught the attention of Tony and his FBI team in the distance. Concerned for their safety, Ms. Lorraine and Katie were swiftly protected by their bodyguards. Shortly after, Reese pushed forward, taking out the enemy one by one. Meanwhile, a member of Tony's team spotted gunfire from the lighthouse tower. Not long after, the FBI team arrived on the island, but Ben saw that a group of troops was approaching him, and he knew he had to leave Reese alone. Then he urged Reese to cancel the mission, but Reese refused to back down. As a result, he was forced to depart hastily, leaving Reese to face the danger alone. Moments later, Reese advanced closer to the main house, deftly taking out the guards along the way until he finally entered the building. To deceive the remaining guards, he deployed a smoke grenade. The sound of gunshots echoed throughout the house, catching the attention of Ms. Lorraine and Katie, who were being held captive. Reacting quickly, Ms. Lorraine dispatched her 2 bodyguards to confront Reese. But he was prepared, and he swiftly disabled the guards with his heat sensor gun. Unbeknownst to Reese, Ms. Lorraine had armed herself with a revolver, and a fierce one-on-one battle ensued. One of her bodyguards managed to shoot him, but Reese retaliated and killed him, while the other surrendered and opened the door to Ms. Lorraine's room. Despite the bodyguard's surrender, Reese continued to fire, relentlessly advancing toward Ms. Lorraine until he finally had her in his sights. At that critical moment, Katie frantically tried to intervene, revealing that Ms. Lorraine was not involved in Steve's bribery scheme. She pleaded with Reese not to shoot Ms. Lorraine, insisting that she could make things right. But Reese was unmoved. He knew that Ms. Lorraine had played a crucial role in the mission's disastrous outcome. As they confronted each other, Reese suddenly faltered from the wound he had sustained in his stomach. Then Katie used the opportunity to appeal to him again, promising that she could get to the bottom of the story and make Ms. Lorraine pay for her mistake. Hearing that, Ms. Lorraine looked on, clearly shocked and contrite. Meanwhile, outside the main house, Tony and his team split up to cover more ground, with him opting to go alone. Back to Reese, who was determined to shoot Ms. Lorraine despite Katie's pleas that another member of the Navy SEALs was the one who received money from Steve. Shortly after, Ms. Lorraine explained that she never intended to hurt him, but he knew she was responsible for the tragedy that had occurred. Suddenly, Reese began to waver due to the gunshot wound he had sustained. Then Katie tried to convince him not to shoot Ms. Lorraine and promised to make her regret her mistake. Hearing that Ms. Lorraine looked remorseful, but Reese was still determined to exact his revenge. However, before Reese could shoot, Ms. Lorraine shocked everyone by shooting herself. The FBI team arrived in the room to find Ms. Lorraine dead on her desk and Katie sitting in stunned silence. Meanwhile, Tony saw Reese leaving the main house and ordered him to stop. At that moment, he ignored Tony's threats and retrieved his diving gear, determined to complete his mission. He told Tony that he was already dead, unafraid of the consequences. As Tony watched Reese disappear into the sea, he received the news that Ms. Lorraine had killed herself. Soon after, Mackenzie asked if Reese was there, but Tony admitted that he had let Reese go. Then he realized Reese was innocent and had been betrayed by the Pentagon. 3 weeks later, there was a massive overhaul within the Pentagon. Thanks to Katie's report, the public discovered that the Pentagon had betrayed Commander James Reese. Despite her best efforts, she couldn't uncover the identity of the owner of the fake company that had received funds from Steve, which remained a mystery. After that, Reese contacted Katie and acknowledged that her news report had helped his cause. Then she disclosed that Oberon Analytics kept the money Steve gave them in a bank in Peru, but she didn't know the identity of the person who received the funds. However, the media continued to report that Commander James Reese was missing and presumed dead, despite Reese still communicating with her via messages. Meanwhile, in Mencora, Peru, Ben finished surfing alone and got into his boat, only to find Reese already waiting for him. Then he questioned Ben about his involvement with Oberon Analytics, perplexed that one of his closest confidants would act against him. In a shocking twist, Ben confesses to designing Reese's last mission in Syria, which led to the deaths of Reese's army. Although he did not anticipate that Reese's family would also be killed, he helped Reese get his revenge by providing assistance. Then he apologizes to Reese and requests that Reese complete his ultimate target list. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out, taking Ben's life. Ultimately, Reese succeeds in avenging his family and army. After that, Reese ascended to the deck of the ship and was transported to his past once again. A crow had smashed into his home, and he predicted that the bird would not survive. He disclosed to his daughter, Lucy, that if he didn't come back from work one day, it meant he had passed away while accomplishing something significant. Furthermore, he assured her that he would always watch over her, even if he were in another place. As the series came to a close, Reese glanced over the list of individuals he had sought vengeance against, realizing that he had succeeded in killing them all. He also caught a glimpse of his daughter's last drawing before tossing it into the ocean. Finally, he resolved to vanish from sight permanently by traveling to a remote location in Niassa, Africa. This series teaches us about the perils of being a soldier, where one may end up on the battlefield and suffer from post-war trauma or be subjected to testing that causes unbearable pain. Reese's experience exemplifies the worst of both worlds, where he endured both traumas simultaneously. This prompts us to question whether becoming a soldier is a wise decision.